Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicole Burdett with MeriTalk. Thanks very much for joining us today. We're looking forward to a great discussion on definitely a hot topic in federal IT, zero trust. But before we get started, I would like to thank Okta for their support and for making both our discussion today and also our recent research on zero trust possible. So just a few housekeeping notes. If you are on the line and you would like to receive CPE credits, please answer each of our polling questions. There'll be 3 of them spread out across the presentation. And then please get in touch with Monica Murphy at MeriTalk after the session. Her email is in that last bullet on your screen now and will appear later in the presentation as well. We'd also like to ask everyone to be interactive with us today. Please feel free to ask any questions that you have. There is a Q&A box on your floating toolbar, and we'll answer as many of those questions as we can towards the end of our presentation. So I'd like to welcome our guest speakers this afternoon and give each of them a moment or two to tell us about their background. First, I'd like to welcome Alper Kerman, Security Engineer and Project Manager for the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. Alper, welcome.
Hi, how are you? Yes, my name is Alper Kerman. I am the project manager and the point of contact for the NIST NCCOE team on the Zero Trust Architecture project. Actually, just to give a quick background on that project, it's a project driven by a federal initiative. It was initiated back in February of this year to do research on zero trust and zero trust architectures with a goal to deliver a document that provides general guidance on ZTA for adoption in the federal government. We actually released a document about a month ago for public comment on September 23rd, and the period is open until November 22nd. And I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Great, thank you. And we have Scott Rose, who is a computer scientist at NIST and is also one of the authors of the draft special publication 800-207 on zero trust architecture. Scott, thanks very much for joining us. Can you also tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm Scott Rose. I'm at the NIST Information Technology Lab. Normally, I've been doing work in core internet protocols and cybersecurity. Now working on as part of the Zero Trust Architecture team. And like I said, I'm one of the authors of the NIST Special Pub 800-207.
Excellent. And next, I'd like to thank Kelsey Nelson for joining us from Okta. Kelsey, would you take a moment and introduce yourself?
Sure, absolutely, and thanks again for having us today. So I'm Kelsey Nelson, I'm on the product marketing team at Okta. I oversee our security solutions, including working with our customers on how they're starting to put zero trust into practice. So really looking forward to today's conversation on to get both Scott and Alper's thoughts on that.
Great. So today we're going to be discussing how and why agencies can move from the typical sort of traditional castle and moat security style to modern zero trust strategies. So I think, as everyone aware, we've got the Cloud Smart initiative out there. We all know that we're moving to the cloud, and we know that doing it right is a government-wide priority and will continue to be. So we'll talk about why zero trust is a valuable tool in the cloud. We'll talk a little bit about some recent research that MeriTalk launched on zero trust. We'll explore the findings to see where federal agencies fall on a zero trust maturity curve. We'll look at some priority projects, and then we'll provide some key steps that you can integrate into your own cybersecurity strategies and planning. So to kick off, I know we're all hearing a lot about zero trust recently. Would like to kick off to define what we're talking about when we mean zero trust. I was at another zero trust panel yesterday at the ACT-IAC ELC conference, and it was interesting as the panelists defined it. Everyone gave a slightly different definition. So I'm very interested in hearing what each of you consider and define it as, and what you add to one another's definitions. Maybe Alper, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, absolutely. No problem. So for me, whenever I start talking about zero trust, I first start with the problem that it tries to address, because we have to understand the problem first. We can understand what zero trust means or is, right? So what problem does it try to address? And to explain that, I usually try to paint this picture in a simple way. I usually start with describing a traditional network infrastructure, which is typically the kind where we build a very large network infrastructure with a bunch of subnets, and then we throw in servers in clustered fashion all over those subnets, and then we try to isolate that entire infrastructure from the internet by just throwing a fence around it, a perimeter, if you will, in order to prevent direct attacks from the internet. And over time, that strategy worked for us really well. But unfortunately for us, hackers weren't just sitting around and twiddling their thumbs either. So as we got better at protecting our outside perimeter, they became more creative with penetrating into our networks. So then suddenly it was very obvious that the outside perimeter isn't working for us as efficiently anymore, because it just isn't able to detect and block attacks when they happen from inside the network. So the crux of the issue there is that when the breach happens from inside the network, in a traditional network infrastructure, the attack surface is very large, and there's no robust mechanism in place to prevent that threat vector's lateral movement. So from my perspective, this is where Zero Trust comes in to save the day. Because it says, since the current way of using the perimeter defense approach doesn't seem to work as efficiently anymore, why don't we tweak that a little bit? Let's tweak it in such a way that they're also effective against the breaches from inside the network. Well, how do we do that? We do that by employing a strategy called deperimeterization, or shrinking or reducing perimeters. Of course, what we're really talking about there in reality is creating a bunch of smaller, more granular perimeters and placing them strategically as close as possible around your data or high-valued assets. So once we do that, now we are essentially saying we can no longer trust implicitly in those zones where we used to have implicit trust before with this approach. So now we have to never trust, always verify before we can grant access to any high-valued assets, because we can no longer differentiate automatically between who the good guys and the bad guys are. So for me, this picture that I just painted is Zero Trust from a conceptual perspective, of course. Now, with this strategy, we, of course, introduced a more complex network infrastructure, because now we have all these smaller microsegmented networks that need to be managed accordingly. And that sort of scenario actually lends itself to a lot of dynamic aspects, complexity that needs to be addressed. So if we are adopting this approach, we now have to do other things that we may have not necessarily done before. We have to devise a way to handle this complex network infrastructure by leveraging or introducing some logical components that will address each complexity. But at the end of the day, it's all about making sure every access request is verified thoroughly by means of different types of authentication methods, trust algorithms, scores that rely on dynamically captured and evaluated real-time information. And so I can go on and talk about it a little bit more in more detail, but then I would be describing as Zero Trust architecture. So that's sort of my take on Zero Trust and Zero Trust architectures.
Great. Great.
Yep.
No, thank you. And Scott or Kelsey, do you have anything you'd like to add or a different aspect you'd like to mention?
Yeah, this is Scott. Like that was good, but also like to add, to kind of make it a high-level view. Zero Trust and Zero Trust architecture. There's not a single solution. I don't want people to walk away with that idea. It's more of a strategy and a way of thinking about your enterprise network and your network infrastructure. It's always going to be a journey, not a destination, as we like to say. And so it involves a lot of things that we always think of good practices kind of rolled up into one. So it shouldn't be called zero trust, in my opinion anyway. It should be called zero implicit trust, because you're not automatically granted access to resources just because you managed to plug into the right network port. But it's a combination of a device identity, user identity, attributes, threat intelligence. Everything goes into those access decisions.
Excellent. And Kelsey, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I agree fully with what Alper and Scott were just mentioning, and I think to build on what Scott mentioned, there isn't a single solution. There isn't when we talk to organizations about zero trust, there isn't a silver bullet with any one technology that's going to be able to solve for all of the challenges that Alper just walked through. But I think, and I know we'll explore this more later on in the conversation too, but it also doesn't mean a wholesale, you don't have to replace every component. It is that journey. And so how can we start to maybe adjust the pieces that we have to get started as we go down that zero trust path that Scott was talking through. So I know we'll talk more about that shortly, but just wanted to add that on as well.
Absolutely. And I think that segues well. I mean, we know that many of our audience members today and many folks throughout the federal government have security initiatives around FISMA, around TIC, around CDM in progress today, as they're working to move to the cloud. Can you folks talk a little bit about how a zero trust strategy can support existing and ongoing cybersecurity efforts, and also how they can integrate the strategy into some of these initiatives that they're already working on?
You want me to jump in, Alper?
Sure, that'd be great.
Okay. One is about continuous diagnostics and mitigation. If we're talking about CDM, and like something like Einstein is more about detecting and blocking potential cyber attacks before they penetrate into our network infrastructure. So a robust CDM system in place can definitely allow us to, figure out what's on the network, who's on the network, what's happening on the network. So all those things are great from that perspective. And Einstein, on the other hand, provides perimeter defense for federal, civilian, executive branch agencies, but it won't be able to detect and block every cyber attack. And so it needs to work with another system like CDM to compensate for that shortcoming, if you will. As for any zero trust architecture, it should include a capable CDM system in place. As a matter of fact, I mentioned earlier about our document. In our ZTA document, we do include that as one of our components that fall under the umbrella of an abstract ZTA that we described. In fact, under that abstract architecture, zero trust architecture, we include other things as well, because, we still need a system that feeds in threat intelligence, right? We still need a system that helps us stay compliant with any regulatory regime like FISMA, HIPAA. We need a system that can provide for data access policy management, PKI system for generating and logging enterprise certs. So ZTA is inclusive of all these existing approaches. And therefore, in a way, ZTA is actually an evolutionary architecture that is in line with existing security controls and standards and frameworks.
Great. And Scott or Kelsey, would you like to add anything to that, talking about how zero trust supports federal cyber efforts, as agencies are moving to the cloud, or very focused on moving to the cloud?
Basically, kind of what Alper said, zero trust and zero trust architecture strategies should be seen as kind of your holistic strategy, because that kind of builds upon all these previous initiatives that federal agencies have been doing, like FICAM, CDM, threat intelligence, everything that they've been doing really are the foundational stuff needed that are key components to kind of a zero trust architecture. But zero trust should be seen as kind of your holistic kind of the guiding principles that are influencing every other component strategy. So kind of think of it that way. It's kind of a ZTA should be your umbrella strategy.
Great. Well, let's move on and look at some new research that MeriTalk just completed. So to find out if agencies are migrating to a zero trust mindset or where they are on the journey, we surveyed 115 federal cybersecurity executives and IT decision makers, and we ended up launching the research the same day as the NIST draft report came out. So that was good timing. You can view the infographic at the URL that's listed on the slide, or you can also click the link under resources on your webinar console after the webinar, and you'll have access to the full webinar if you'd like to dig in a little bit further. And before we dive in and talk about the research, we're going to take a short break for our first poll question. Please keep in mind that if you would like to obtain continuing professional education credits, CPEs, you do have to take all of today's polls and email mmurphy@meritalk.com after the webcast to get your certificate. So please take a moment to answer this question. Has your agency faced an increase in cyber breaches within the last 5 years? Should be an easy. Okay, so let's move forward and dive in. So our research shows that 93%, so almost all federal agencies, report that they've implemented at least one security solution that maps to a modern zero trust strategy. But just a third of agencies report that they have an active zero trust initiative. Alper, how does this gap surprise you, and why do you think there's that disconnect?
No, it doesn't surprise me. And I would say the main reason is education. Federal agencies have been adopting better security controls and have been increasing their security postures in the right direction all along, I would say. Most, though, don't realize that some of those solutions that they've already adopted are covered by the zero trust principles and approaches. So with our draft document, actually, one of our objectives was to educate and increase awareness surrounding zero trust and what an abstract zero trust architecture should encompass. Along with that, we tried to provide some language and conceptual view regarding zero trust, too, so that we're able to begin at a level to start the conversation in moving towards zero trust architectures. After all, if we don't have a unifying language and understanding of ZTA, how can we procure zero trust technologies, right? Or even have a solid acquisition strategy?
Yep, great points. Kelsey, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I would echo in some of the conversation that we had with the last question here. You know, when we talk to organizations all over the globe, right, they are starting to hear, and they start to, you know, if you go to many security conferences, you'll see the term zero trust is, you know, all over the place. And I think starting to hear that this term and what it actually means and making that tangible, that education piece that Alper was talking about, is starting to fill that gap between this maybe buzzword territory to also this is reflective of, I think, all of those trends that Alper and Scott just spoke to. You know, even again with some of the other initiatives that agencies are facing, or efforts that agencies are going through right now and already. And so while they may not realize that those are all contributing pieces to that umbrella that Scott described for a holistic zero trust strategy, I think we're starting to see. We actually ran a similar survey earlier in the year that was more global, and it only had about 10% of respondents said that they had a defined zero trust initiative. So I think even seeing that that's now a third for federal agencies, I think we're starting to see that momentum pick up, and maybe the component that Alper talked to starting to gain traction. And hopefully we'll see more of that in the weeks and months to come as well.
Absolutely. So we're going to take a brief break for our second poll question now, asking the audience where they are. So which best describes the status of zero trust in your organization? And again, if you do want your CPEs, you do have to answer all the questions. And please take a brief moment to answer now, and we'll share responses shortly as well. And just a friendly reminder too, please submit any questions via the Q&A box on your floating toolbar that you might have, and we'll respond to many of these as possible during the Q&A portion at the end of our webinar. Yeah, and as you can see, I think on all of your screens, a fairly large portion, about 50%, of the audience is reporting that you're in the discovering stage. So you're learning about zero trust and how it can work for your agency. Okay, so we're going to move on and talk about the zero trust adoption curve. Okta actually mapped out a maturity curve of the various identity stages of zero trust: fragmented identity, unified identity and access management, contextual access, and adaptive workforce. Kelsey, can you share how the federal progress that you see here compares to what you saw on your zero trust industry research that you did on a more global scale that you mentioned a moment ago?
Sure. So I guess maybe also giving a little more context to this maturity curve. And again, as Nicole mentioned, this is specific to the identity piece of your zero trust strategy. So as we mentioned at the very beginning of this, we don't see any one technology being that silver bullet or that's going to solve all of zero trust. But we do hear many organizations are using identity as a foundational component or one of the first places that they're starting. And so we wanted to put maybe some steps into what that can look like from a roadmap perspective as you start down your zero trust journey. And so what we hear from organizations, the sort of bucket through the stages that they move through, many, and I think this is reflected here for federal agencies as well, the vast majority of organizations we're talking to fall in that sort of stage zero getting started category, where you might see that they have on-premises directories, AD LDAP, they might be starting to adopt cloud technologies, and those things don't necessarily connect yet. And so they're really starting to wrap their arms around the broad ecosystem that they have to manage. And so that's really where we see most organizations. And I think you see on the slide here, the federal agencies specifically reported that 67% don't have that unified user directory across all of those cloud and on-premises applications. When you start to see that shift into that stage one is really where we see organizations are starting to, again, as I mentioned, wrap their arms around that broader ecosystem. So being able to implement that modern, maybe a modern single sign-on solution that connects both into those cloud and on-premises applications, layering on multi-factor authentication is really in that first bucket. And you can see here, this is actually where we saw some of the differences with that industry research versus federal agencies. We did see, I think from here on out is where we start to see maybe more of a drop, or the industry tends to be a little further ahead here. You'll see we have about 15% of agencies have reported implementing both SSO and MFA, and we tend to see it's a little higher on the industry side. And then as you start to progress forward into that stage two is where we're bringing in a lot more context. I think Scott mentioned this in some of the earlier conversations. What's all feeding into that authentication decision? What real-time data can we evaluate to make sure that we're that we have high likelihood that person is who they say they are before we grant them access into a specific resource? And so that contextual access bucket is really starting to feed in different pieces of context. It could be from device, it could be location, from all of those different components from the user identity themselves, and being able to set policies against them. And I think most folks on the call here will be unsurprised that as a part of that contextual and policy engine, we also see organizations start to deploy different factor types for potentially different users or different use cases. One unique thing for the federal space, for example, is Certainly the use of PIV-CAC is overwhelmingly the most used factor in the federal space. We do see different factor types, everything from certainly would not recommend the SMS security question, but we do see adoption of that depending on user groups, to stronger factors like a WebAuthn or FIDO2 adopted kind of across the board. So that's really where we see that second bucket. Another interesting, I think, sort of difference between the industry survey and also the federal agencies is this idea of provisioning, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that shortly, but being able to manage all of this complexity, so the managing access to applications, both cloud and on-prem, not just for the employees of an agency, but also potentially contractors or partners. That ecosystem, we do see a pretty significant drop-off in the industry side, and being able to manage both of those users, not just your core employees, but that broader group. And actually, the federal side seems to have did report having maybe a more narrowed gap there, which I thought was interesting, the complexity of those agencies. And then, of course, the last bucket here, we have very few, both from industry and agency side, are really in that fully adaptive, being able to pull in risk signals from across the environment and starting to deploy things like a passwordless or a seamless authentication experience. So that's kind of the landscape here. I know I just threw a lot of numbers and talked a lot on here, so I'll pause for a moment.
Sounds great. Alper and Scott, we know that you've spoken to teams across the federal government as you worked on the Zero Trust special publication and research. Is there anything here that surprises you or that you'd like to note?
From my perspective, no, not really. Federal agencies are, usually slow to move in that kind of direction because, there's a lot of other constraints that play a role preventing agencies to move forward with some of these newer ways of implementing things, and plus, we hold on to, in the government, we hold on to legacy applications and legacy systems, so it's really not surprising.
Alper, could you or Scott talk a little bit more about some of these challenges? What are some of the challenges that agencies are facing, and what are some of the steps that they can take to help overcome those challenges as they move forward on the path to stage one?
Scott, one of them I already mentioned. I mean, as I said, I think first of all, there's budget constraints that play a role, and then the layers of justification and approvals required by phasing out legacy applications and legacy systems, that they play a major role too, in my opinion, anyway. So these are kind of the roadblocks that happens in the federal government. I'm not sure if there's a way to speed that up, because in the federal government, we have to always provide paperwork for everything, right? And it has to be agreed upon every time we make changes to our topology.
I'd say, it all boils down to, even on the same as the private sector, time and money. Unfortunately, if you have new missions coming, you may not always have the money to do the refresh cycle on these old legacy apps. And so I think moving to a zero trust strategy means you're going to have to kind of do your risk analysis for every workflow, look at the ones that are most critical to the mission of the agency or the organization, and then develop a plan to kind of fit in migrating to a kind of a zero trust strategy based on the refresh cycles of those workflows. And that's something that it takes a lot of cooperation within an agency. It takes budgeting and planning, and just like in the private sector, that's none of those happens on a dime. So yeah.
Right.
Very true.
Definitely not. Okay, so While most agencies and teams might be in the beginning stages of the zero trust identity process, we do see that some concepts are taking root. We can see that some of the top priorities over the next 12 to 18 months here, and what percentage have already completed these actions. Kelsey, we'd love to get your thoughts here. Is there anything about these priorities and where they are that surprise you? And what do you feel these priorities mean for federal agencies?
Sure. So I think the column on the far right that talks about that unified user directory across all applications. So really what we mean by this is if you have a potentially an on-premises directory or you're using other systems as your records or your sources of truth for our user information, and then also have all those different applications, very likely both cloud and on-premises, since that's, I think, the reality for most organizations today. How can you start to potentially consolidate and or connect all of those pieces? And I think to some of the conversation we had before is that I think one of the top, what this says is that the top priority for agencies is really finding ways to start to shift a lot of that and to start to optimize and modernize those core systems, and that being the number one priority here, so that they can start to tackle some of these other challenges. Like the other two are focused on automation around provisioning and deprovisioning. And again, I mentioned that discrepancy we see here between both the employees, but also those external users being partners, contractors, potentially even constituents or beneficiaries. And so how can we first put those foundational building blocks into place, being that number one priority? And I think one of the first steps that need to be taken, and then starting to see what are ways that we can to drive efficiencies and start to optimize our environment through things like automated provisioning and deprovisioning, so that we can focus our resources on maybe those other areas of risk and doing those further evaluations.
Great. And Alper and Scott, let's take a moment to talk about the third of agencies in the gold area that are prioritizing automated provisioning for employees or external users or for a unified directory. What do they, from your perspective, need to consider over the next year or so as they solve for these needs?
Okay, I'll go. Basically, I guess one thing that they need to think about or they should be doing is looking at what they have now and what are vital pieces that they either can't change right away or that are that they want to use as the kind of the linchpin for everything else. If there's certain apps that are used by their workflows that are vital, and then see what kind of solutions would fit into that. Obviously, they you want to have your apps that have an open standard. One of the things that we were kind of looking at as we were doing our survey is the need for, or the desire to have open standards there. In fact, some of them already exist for things like identity and device and threat intelligence that you can use for like these customs apps that exist that you can plug into some sort of larger identity management system. And that way that gets you one step closer to a zero trust strategy. So those are the things that they need to be thinking about. It's like, what are they using now? What needs to change? And what direction do they want to go in?
Great. And Scott, do you have anything to add in terms of advice you would give agencies about things they should consider over the next 12 months or so as they start to address some of these needs?
Not knowing what each individual agency has, it's kind of hard to tell. But like I said, it's one of the key things is one of the core foundations of zero trust is device identity, which is your CDMs kind of systems and things like that, and your identity management system and identity governance. Because the old joke for networking is the network would be great and secure if it weren't for all the users, but you realize that without the users, there's no use for anything. I mean, they're the ones that are performing the mission for the agency. So you need to have a system in place that can establish trust in user identity and perform those actions and make sure that the people get access to what they need to get access, and and they get denied access what they shouldn't be looking at, as well as people that aren't trusted within the organization don't have access to vital resources.
Great. So let's talk about building a broader zero trust strategy over the long term. Scott, you acknowledge in the report that most agencies will operate in what you call a hybrid zero trust / legacy mode for a time while they continue to invest in modernization initiatives and move these initiatives forward. And I'm sure this comes as a relief to many on the line who don't have the financial or organizational support to make zero trust happen overnight. And I'm sure it's no matter how much support you have, it's impossible to make it happen overnight. So, we have the ZTA deployment cycle from your report up on the screen. Can you talk us through what agencies should think about as they manage through this hybrid time period?
All right. Like I said, if as you're reading the draft, and as we were thinking about it, we thought that the roadmap to kind of a zero trust strategy or to implement zero trust strategies for workflows kind of maps nicely to the risk management framework, which first you kind of identify for the users and the devices and the workflows, and that's and then you categorize them, and then you pick one, you pick a system, like an email system or HR or employee onboarding, and then you work on getting that workflow upgraded to, I guess you say, into a kind of a ZTA kind of strategy framework, if you want to call it that or whatever, knowing that there's not really a ZTA solution. This is kind of you fit it into that kind of mind space of how you think about it, and then you start kind of implementing that. And then you're operating in that time frame for that new workflow with certain ZT inspired elements added, and you have to observe. And then if anything happens, things change in an enterprise all the time. You may end up going back to recategorizing. Let's say you're switching vendors, you're switching employees, you're a certain user group, you're assuming the work of another unit. All these things change, and you have to kind of go back into that cycle. And this kind of thinking as cycles kind of helps kind of formulate the right kind of mindset for zero trust. And then this is that's why I said it's kind of a growing thing. You'll never reach the destination of pure zero trust, as I don't know if it actually exists. But this kind of way of thinking is what zero trust is really about. It's more of a strategy and a way of thought process than an actual architecture that you can map out on a diagram.
Great. And just one follow-up question for yourself or for Alper. When you talk about picking a system, be it HR or other, what are some of the things that you consider as you pick that system? What makes it a good candidate?
Well, it's a system that is being accessed from so many different permission levels, right? So you have people that manage the system, and then you have the end users, and then everybody else that falls in between to manage the data on a system like that. From that perspective, it's a great I would call it a test bed in a way to play with to address the zero trust aspect of things from all those aspects. Great.
And Kelsey, we know that agencies like DISA are implementing zero trust pilot programs today. What advice would you give to those agencies as they start mapping out their zero trust strategies?
Sure. Well, I think, I would reflect on some of what Scott shared when walking through this process on the slide, right? There's a lot of components into understanding what is in your environment first and foremost before starting to plot out where you can start to tackle different areas of risk. And I think being able to go through that process is in and of itself going to be really critical to understanding where are those biggest, where can we start to have the greatest impact maybe quickly and start to build that foundation, because again, I know this is mentioned a couple of times, but it is a journey, and threat actors are going to constantly be evolving, and so we need to be constantly evolving too, and really understanding where our system stands is absolutely foundational. We do hear from many organizations that the people component is, I think, in the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, we hear about phishing and about credential-oriented breaches, or being a credential-oriented attacks being a major cause of breach. So we do see that as an area of opportunities to tackle early on, to help put protections around that component. But I do think, again, being able to understand that your systems is really going to be the most critical step to get started on.
Great. So we'd like to turn now to our last poll question. How do you see Zero Trust most supporting federal cyber efforts? We'll give everyone a moment to answer the question, and we'll share the responses on your screen shortly. So final reminder, if you do want your CPE credits, please email mmurphy@meritalk.com at the end of the program to get your CPE certificate. You'll have just another second or two to answer this one, and then we will move forward. Okay, so before we get to the Q&A, and we have gotten some great questions from the audience, so we appreciate that. But before we address them, I'd like to take just a moment to thank our guests and open the floor to closing comments from our panelists. Alper, Scott, and Kelsey, do you have any sort of final thoughts that you'd like to share before we move into the Q&A?
I can jump in and just say that I ditto, my colleagues on the panel, their comments, and really just to summarize it all, it really boils down to becoming knowledgeable about what Zero Trust actually means. What problem it addresses, and what it brings to the table. Because from the federal agency's perspective, most agencies don't even realize, they're already in line with Zero Trust from certain aspects. So it all starts with what Zero Trust means and what a ZTA includes or should not include. Just kind of summarizing what we said, understanding your current network infrastructure, identifying your current security controls, determining which ones are in line with ZTA, which ones aren't. And as Scott mentioned, it's and Kelsey, you have to. It's a roadmap. You have to tackle the rest one by one in time with goal to mature level ZTA, but that's debatable also, right? So mature level ZTA is going to be different for everyone. And also the other thing to realize is that there's still ZTA is still a area that requires a lot more research. Today, when we're combining technologies, Zero Trust technologies, to come up with a Zero Trust architecture, we're gluing things through, for example, custom APIs. There's no standardization there. So I think all of this is going to sort itself out, some of these problems. That's just one that I mentioned. In time, and in the meantime, it's basically a roadmap. So we take it one day at a time.
Thank you. Scott, Kelsey, anything to add?
Okay, yeah, I'd kind of like to reiterate that. Yeah, it's to say first off, don't believe the hype when it comes to Zero Trust. It's not something so new and alien. You must throw away everything that you've been doing and focus on the new hot buzzword. Mainly because at its foundation, Zero Trust is the fundamentals that we've always been kind of talking about all this time. Device security, analytics, monitoring, identity governance, and identity management. All these are key to kind of a Zero Trust strategy for cybersecurity. So it's not something that everybody needs to be, stop what you're doing and where you need to rush out and get zero trust stuff, because there's no single stuff that'll be an instant fix. It's more of planning and operations, and thinking about how you're actually doing things now, and then what you need to do things better. So yeah, there's no single solution.
Great. And Kelsey, any final thoughts before we dive into some audience questions?
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep it pretty short because I think I would just echo what both Alper and Scott mentioned. Right, this is very much, I think, a term that has grown in prominence over the last couple of years, but is very much reflective of what the security industry has been seeing as a needed shift in how we need to rethink our security for today's threats. And I think, again, would echo there's a lot of components to this. I think many of those components, agencies may have pieces of it, and they need to rethink maybe how they're being used in practice today for zero trust. So I don't think it needs to be this a whole, complete redoing of everything. It's a journey, and I think many organizations that they are on. And as we continue to explore what this can look like in practice, there's lots more to come. So thank you. And I'll wrap up there.
Great. So we'll address a few of the questions from the audience. The first one, Scott, is actually addressed your way. Let's see. The question is, why does NIST 800-207 stray from the guidance in the Federal Enterprise Architecture 2.0?
We're trying not to. We don't want to. But the idea is that this 800-207 is not really meant to be a guidance document in the traditional sense. It's more of I'm looking at it more as a conceptual framework about actually developing strategies, and then you actually have an architecture that you build from those kind of strategies. We didn't actually want to have diagrams where we draw like this component goes here on your network, this component goes there. Instead, we wanted to say like this is the kind of high level conceptual view of all the logical components of a zero trust strategy. And then from there, you will develop your own internal architecture from there. But again, there's more work to be done. I think that might be the whole subject of a whole other work about how to integrate those sort of things. But yeah, unfortunately, that wasn't the purpose of the guide. We wanted to be a little higher level and not describe a single architecture. So yeah, that's kind of why we didn't bring in a whole lot of things. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff there that we wanted to bring in, but in order to keep it short and high level, we chose to kind of put it off for now. Not saying we won't go back.
Got it. Great. And then Kelsey, we have a question that came in on the maturity model, so I'll ask if you can address this one. The question is, what is meant by frictionless access in stage 3? And as organizations start their zero trust journey, what are some of the skills or training actions that someone can obtain to get smart on zero trust?
Sure. So that first question, talking about frictionless access, really what we're referring to there is how can we make it easier for you? I think this is an interesting balance, but in this case, often one of the examples I would give for frictionless access is a passwordless experience. But I think more holistically, it's interesting when I talk to security leaders about their zero trust, about the value that they see in zero trust. It's not just a security benefit, but it's also, if implemented with all of that rich context and all of that evaluation that we talked about earlier today, you can actually provide an even better user experience as well. And so I think there's an interesting, as you kind of move through that curve, you don't instantly think passwordless as being a security benefit, but I think that being able to speak to and hearing from security leaders about being a business and organizational enabler and what the role that can be in actually in not only helping drive additional security, but additional productivity and efficiency for your agency and your workforce is is really what we mean by that component. In terms of the second part of your question, which I think was around training and skills, I know this is still pretty new. Forrester has done, I'll call it Forrester, they've done a lot of work on this and a lot of thinking around how can you start to put these different components into practice. So I would certainly give a shout out to take a look at some of the work and the research that they're putting out. I think they're working on or releasing a certification as well. So I would peek at that. We'll also, that maturity curve and some of these data insights that we have is certainly specific to the identity portion, but we'll actually have a live version of that assessment, so you can take it on your own and sort of see where you fall in the identity piece. Again, that's not a holistic zero trust strategy, but it hopefully will help at least build the foundational component for that aspect as well. So those would be at least two to get started with. I'm not sure if Alper or Scott, you have any others that come to mind, though.
So we have another question, Scott. We'll direct this one your way. If an agency uses multi-factor authentication and role-based access control for its network and requires subsequent re-authentication for some cloud-based applications using the same credentials, is that zero trust? If they're asking a fundamental question of what is zero trust and does that qualify?
I would answer sorta, yeah. I mean, it's not. There's other components in there as well. Is like, where is this access being requested from? Is it done by an enterprise-owned system or not? Is it the system patched? Is the system magically located in Chicago or Eastern Europe? There's a whole bunch of other questions that go into this granting of trust. This is actually, but this is one of those things, and it's a really good one. That yes, you need to have this kind of almost, I wouldn't say continuous authentication, but there's constant reevaluation of that user identity trust. So yes, that is one of the components in zero trust. So I mean, I don't want to say there's no referee ruling of that zero trust or not, but that's on the path. That's definitely one of the components that needs to be there.
Can I jump in? Can I jump in
Yeah.
and add to what my colleague just said? So we have to also keep in mind, we're with this approach, we're in a more microsegmented network. So, if we take a single user as an example, right? They at 10 o'clock in the morning they access, let's say, server A, just to paint the picture simplistically. And then an hour later, maybe they just went to Starbucks and they just logged in and accessing now this time a different system. Right. So now their security posture just automatically changes based on where they're coming from. And maybe in the meantime, they got on their browser and they went to some websites that they maybe shouldn't have. Or maybe they're logging on, they're using a corporate laptop that's not, patched or behind patches. So these sort of things, come into play. When you're, because these are very important things to consider dynamically, and because we have a more granular perimeters now, so to speak, we have to, when we're going from one, endpoint to another endpoint, we have to keep using authentication. We have to verify before we can trust. So that's kind of what I would like to add, that the nature of this approach brings about this dynamic environment, and that you have to consistently tap into real-time information to make some decisions.
Great. And Kelsey, do you have anything you'd like to add on that one?
No, I was going to similar to Scott sort of, was going to be my response there. And I think to all of the context that both my colleagues Scott and Alper just spoke to, it's I think there's a lot more that goes behind that understanding of risk around each of those individual authentication attempts, and understanding what has changed, if anything, and what action may I need to take in order to, potentially re-verify it with a different method, or, deny access if something too drastic has changed. So I think being able to have the flexibility to understand and to continuously reassess those changes, and then also to dynamically make decisions based on those changes. Do I need to step up? Do I need to require a different factor type? Maybe they need a PIVCAC in this scenario, but in this scenario they can use a different factor, maybe WebAuthn or something along those lines. So being able to have that flexibility. So I guess, again, I would see that on the path. With all of that, the more that you can bring in that understanding of risk is just going to make it that much stronger.
Thank you. Great. So we have time for a final question that Alper will direct your way.
Okay.
The question is, does zero trust require full encryption of all internal traffic from your perspective?
Yes.
Okay.
I would recommend it wholeheartedly because, again, it just kind of goes along the way, what I mentioned previously in terms of granular, network infrastructure. So, right when you're in that kind of environment, you're basically one thing to keep in mind is that we no longer have implicit trust. So we are now functioning in a zone where there's no implicit trust, and so it's very wise to encrypt your network. So that's one way of catching things, right? And granting access to identifying users, and so. The answer is yes.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Just a quick reminder: if you did answer the polling questions, this is Monica's email address to get your certificate of completion. And on behalf of all my colleagues at MeriTalk, I'd like to thank first Scott and Kelsey and Alper for sharing your experience and perspective with us today. I'd like to thank Okta for supporting the webinar and our research. And I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for joining us. As a reminder, if you missed anything, if you'd like to review some of the materials that were presented or discussed, we will be posting a recording of this webinar, and we'll send it to all of the attendees with the link so you can likewise share with colleagues. So thank you again, and everyone, hope you have a great afternoon.